My name is Ashley, and I am 26 years old. The night everything I thought I knew about my family blew up started with the softest sound in the room, a tiny, polite clink of crystal. It was my graduation dinner for my master's in design, one of those over-the-top nights my parents live for. We were at a Michelin 3-star restaurant in San Francisco, surrounded by white tablecloths and a bill I knew I could not afford, even if I sold everything I owned. My grandma, Catherine, stood up, smiled at me, and said, "Ashley, I am so proud of how wisely you've handled the $5,400,000 I set aside for you." My fork froze. $5 million? I was currently eating ramen noodles just to make rent. Everything went silent. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who is part of our community. The $5,400,000. Those words did not just hang in the air. They acted like a chemical agent, stripping away the polished facade of the dining room until only the raw, ugly truth remained. I looked across the table at Patricia and Gregory, my parents. Their faces were not a study in joy for my success. They were a study in pure, unadulterated panic. They were not shocked that the money existed. They were terrified that the secret had been leaked. My heart did not break. It went cold. It felt like a computer system performing a hard reboot after a fatal crash. I did not cry. I did not even drop my silver fork. I placed it down on the fine china with surgical precision, the click echoing in the sudden vacuum of the room. In that moment, I realized my relationship with them was never a bond of blood. It was a lopsided business transaction where I had been the silent investor in their version of a perfect family. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for 26 years. This was not a graduation celebration anymore. It was the beginning of an audit. The rest of the dinner was a performance. I watched my parents navigate the next hour with the skill of veteran con artists. They toasted to my future, they laughed at Grandma Catherine's stories, and they even hugged me for the cameras. Every "we are so proud of you" felt like a counterfeit bill being passed across a counter. I just nodded. I was no longer a participant. I was a witness. I could feel them watching me, measuring my silence, trying to figure out if the bomb had a timer or if I was going to detonate right there among the elite of San Francisco. When we finally stood on the sidewalk outside, the city air felt clinical and sharp. Grandma Catherine's car pulled up, and she kissed my cheek, promising we would discuss my future soon. I felt her hand on mine, the only real thing I had left. Then her taillights faded into the distance, and the masks my parents were wearing began to slip. "We will talk later this week, Ashley," my father said, his voice attempting to regain that casual authority he used to control my life. He turned toward his car, clearly expecting me to disappear back to my cramped studio. "No," I said. My voice was flat and hard. "I'm riding with you. We are talking tonight." My mother opened her mouth, her eyes darting around as she searched for a way to gaslight me back into my role as the difficult daughter. But she saw the clarity in my eyes and stopped. I was not the daughter they could manipulate anymore. I was a creditor. The drive to the Palo Alto mansion was the longest 30 minutes of my life. We walked inside, and my father headed for the kitchen, desperate for the comfort of a drink. "Sit," I commanded, standing in the doorway. They both flinched as if I had struck them. The investigation was officially open. I was not leaving until every single cent of that $5,400,000 was accounted for. The kitchen smelled like expensive mahogany and the kind of high-end espresso I could never afford. My father reached for a crystal decanter, his hand trembling. I watched him pour a drink, my mind flashing back to every moment I had been made to feel like a burden. For years, I believed I was the family's greatest expense. I was the unstable one, the daughter who was too emotional to handle her own life. Tyler was the family's golden investment, the tech prince of Palo Alto. Every time he had a new disruptive application idea that crashed before it even left beta, my parents were there with open wallets. I watched them buy him a new high-end electric vehicle for his 24th birthday because he was under so much stress. Meanwhile, I was working 2 jobs and a weekend freelance gig just to pay for my master's. I remember begging for help with a $300 dental bill last winter. My mother looked at me with that practiced pity and said, "Ashley, we have already given you so much. You need to learn the value of a dollar." I learned it while eating ramen in a Brooklyn studio where the bathroom ceiling was sagging with mold. I learned it every time I skipped a meal to make my minimum student loan payment. The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. While I was calculating how to make $20 last an entire week, they were using my $5,400,000 as a private bank for my brother's failures. I realized then that I had been living in a prison without bars. It was a psychological cage built from the ground up by the people who were supposed to protect me. They did not just take my money, they took my confidence. They labeled me fragile so I would not ask questions. They called me difficult whenever I noticed the math did not add up. It is a specialized kind of cruelty, convincing a child they are the one who is failing, even as you are the one stealing their future. I stood there in that marble-clad kitchen, looking at the 2 people who had performed the ultimate heist. They had not just stolen $4,100,000 of my inheritance. They had stolen my 21st year, my 22nd. Every year I spent crying in that moldy apartment, wondering what I had done to deserve such a hard life. I was not the broken one. I was the survivor who did not know the war had already been won for her 26 years ago. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for too long. I looked at my father, who would not meet my eyes, and my mother, who was still trying to adjust her pearls. The justification for what I was about to do was not just in the bank statements I was going to find. It was in the years of invisible chains I was finally ready to break. "I'm going to need every login," I said, my voice echoing off the expensive countertops. "Every business entity name, every transfer record. And I am going to need them before the sun comes up." My father's glass hit the counter with a dull thud. Patricia did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She just smoothed her silk skirt and sighed, a sound of heavy, artificial burden. "We did not steal anything, Ashley," she said, the word theft apparently too sharp for her refined ears. "We moved some assets, $4,100,000 to be exact." Gregory cleared his throat, finally looking up from his glass. "Tyler's startup needed runway. He is the future of this family's name in Silicon Valley. We thought we could replace it before you ever even knew it was there. And that kitchen renovation, it was for the house. Your house, eventually." I looked at them, and I saw it, the trap of cruel normalization. To them, this was not a crime. It was just family management. This is a classic dynamic where a family chooses a golden child, in this case, Tyler, and everyone else becomes a resource to be harvested for his success. Over 26 years, they had normalized the idea that my needs were secondary to his ambitions. They were not just stealing money, they were stealing my right to exist as an equal. "You moved my entire future into a failed application and a marble island," I said, my voice cold as liquid nitrogen. Then came the pivot, the gaslighting. Patricia stepped closer, her face shifting into a mask of maternal concern that made my skin crawl. "Ashley, honey, you are not well. You have been so stressed lately. First, the loans you claim you have, and now this paranoid obsession with numbers. We have been worried about your mental stability for months." "I have a master's degree," I countered. "I know how to read a balance sheet." Gregory stood up, his face hardening. "No, you do not. You are sounding hysterical, paranoid. If you keep this up, if you go to your grandmother with these delusions, we will not have a choice. We will have to have you evaluated. For your own safety, a mental health facility might be the only place where you can get the help you clearly need." It was a threat. Plain and simple. Talk, and we will lock you away. They were counting on the fragile label they had spent years pinning on me. They thought I would shrink back into the shadows. But they did not realize that when you take everything from someone, you also take away their fear. "Try it," I said, grabbing my bag. "But you had better hope those doctors can work faster than a team of forensic accountants." I did not wait for the sun to rise to start my own counteroffensive. I pulled my car over into a dark corner of a parking lot in Palo Alto, the silence of the night pressing against the windows, like the threats my parents had just leveled at me. I did not call a therapist or a friend to cry about being called unstable. I called Grandma Catherine. I did not start with an apology for waking her. I started with a statement of fact. They threatened to have me committed to a mental health facility because I found out about the $5,400,000. Grandma Catherine's voice did not sound like that of a frail 78-year-old woman. It sounded like the founder of an empire who had just been handed a declaration of war. She did not ask if I was sure. She did not try to defend her son. She simply said, "I trusted people who did not deserve it. I will not make that mistake twice." She told me she had already contacted Lauren Kim, a forensic accountant who specialized in following money when people tried very hard to bury the trail. 2 days later, I was not sitting in a locked ward. I was sitting in Lauren Kim's office in San Francisco. The space was minimalist, white walls, sharp angles, and a single dead plant that suggested facts were the only things allowed to survive there. Lauren did not look like an accountant. She looked like a surgeon about to perform a necessary amputation. She slid a legal pad in front of her and told me to tell her what I thought happened so we could figure out what actually happened. We signed the authorization forms, and the bank records started pouring in. Lauren worked with a lethal precision. 2 weeks later, she called me back to her office. She had laid out a stack of papers thick enough to be a manuscript, but she had transformed the mess into a map. She had color-coded every transaction, red for withdrawals tied to my mother and father, orange for anything linked to Tyler. There was a lot of red and orange. Lauren tapped a cluster of orange lines on the chart. "This is when the runway started," she said. "Large chunks of money, hundreds of thousands at a time, leaving my trust and entering a limited liability company tied to Tyler's technology startup." Then there were the red lines, payments for a second mortgage, a luxury lake house, and even a dummy grant they had titled the Evelyn Future Leaders Grant. The only beneficiary was Tyler. They had built an entire fake structure to make the theft look like a legitimate family investment. The total amount missing was $4,100,000. Looking at the charts, it did not look like a bank statement anymore. It looked like a circuit diagram of a house being wired to explode. My parents were not guardians. They were scavengers. They had been bleeding my safety net dry to keep their Palo Alto illusion alive. This was not a misunderstanding or a series of bad luck investments. It was misappropriation on a massive scale. I felt a strange sense of clarity as I stared at the red and orange ink. Anger was not loud this time. It was clinical. I was done being the emotional daughter. I was the primary creditor in a $4 million fraud case. "Set it up," I told Lauren. "Send the demand letter. I want them to see exactly what we have found." The Evelyn Future Leaders Grant was just the beginning of the paper trail. As Lauren Kim dug deeper into the digital shadows of my parents' financial entities, the true nature of the conspiracy began to crystallize into something far more sinister than simple greed. It was not just a series of bad investments. It was a calculated dowry for a technological dynasty. Lauren slid a printed screenshot of a private email chain across the desk. The recipients were my father, Gregory, and the chief financial officer of a major venture capital firm in the Valley. The subject line was "Strategic Alliance and Familial Integration." In cold, professional language, my father had negotiated a contribution to their latest fund, $4,100,000, in exchange for their public endorsement of Tyler's newest project, and, more importantly, their blessing for Tyler to marry their youngest daughter. My brother was not building a startup. He was buying a seat at the table of the elite, and he was using my erased future to pay the entry fee. They were literally trading my inheritance for a better social standing and a powerful connection. The betrayal felt less like a family conflict and more like a hostile takeover where I was the asset being liquidated. "But here is the lethal blow, Ashley," Lauren said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute professional finality. She pulled a series of physical documents from a blue folder, the wire transfer orders for the trust, Each one required a signature from the guardian and the beneficiary once I had turned 25. I had turned 25 6 months ago. I looked at the lines where my name should have been. The signature was a masterpiece of mimicry. It had the same slight tilt, the same loop on the letter Y that I had practiced since high school. But it was not mine. I ran these through a digital handwriting analysis, Lauren explained. They are perfect copies, likely traced or generated via software. Your parents did not just borrow the money, Ashley. They committed forgery. This is no longer a civil dispute over an inheritance. This is a criminal offense. I stared at the forged ink on the page. In that moment, any remaining impulse to offer a family settlement died. A signature is a person's digital fingerprint, the legal proof of their will. By faking mine, they had not just stolen $4,100,000, they had attempted to erase my agency entirely. They had turned my identity into a tool for their fraud. They are not just ungrateful, I said, looking up at Lauren. They are criminals. And criminals do not get family meetings. They get indictments. The professional escalation was complete. Anger was not a noise anymore. It was a strategy. I was not just a daughter looking for an apology. I was a victim of a multi-million-dollar crime, and I had the color-coded evidence to bury them. I called our lawyer, Daniel, and gave him the only instruction that mattered. File it, all of it, and make sure the district attorney gets a copy of these signatures. The courtroom was silent, save for the rhythmic clicking of a court reporter's keys. It was a sterile, wood-paneled room in San Jose where my family's carefully constructed Palo Alto illusion was finally scheduled for demolition. Patricia sat at the defense table, her hands shaking so hard she had to tuck them under her thighs. Gregory stared at the floor, his expensive suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big on his shrinking frame. There were no cameras allowed, but the world was watching anyway. While my parents were scrambling to hire lawyers with the last of their credit, I had taken the narrative public. I had posted the entire story on a popular online forum, anonymized at first, but the evidence was so specific that Silicon Valley's online sleuths connected the dots in hours. My post had crossed 100,000 upvotes. The Evelyn Future Leaders Grant was now a global meme for financial fraud. Tyler's Tech Dynasty wedding had been canceled by the other family 48 hours after the post went viral. They did not want a forged signature in their family tree. During a brief recess, Patricia cornered me in the hallway. She did not look like a high society matron anymore. She looked like a cornered animal. She actually dropped to her knees, her voice a desperate, shrill whisper. Ashley, please. We are your blood. If you go through with this, we lose everything. The house, our reputation, your brother's future. Do something for the family. I looked down at her, feeling a strange, clinical detachment. Anger was not loud anymore. It was a completed balance sheet. I already did something for the family, I said. I funded your lies for $4,100,000. The subscription is over. When we returned, the judge did not even take an hour to deliberate. The evidence of forgery and misappropriation was irrefutable. The verdict was read with a heavy finality. Patricia and Gregory were ordered jointly to repay the full loss of $4,100,000 to the trust plus interest. The judge also referred the forgery evidence to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Watching them being escorted out of the room, I realized they were suffering from the power illusion of the empty wallet. For decades, they believed they were powerful because they had money. They built their entire identity on a foundation of luxury that was actually rented from my future. When the money was gone, they realized they had no internal value, no character to fall back on. Their position in society was just a shell they had hired with stolen funds. The money did not bring me joy, but it brought me air. I paid off my student loans in a single afternoon, $120,000 gone with a single click. I moved out of the moldy studio and into a space where the ceiling did not sag under the weight of my anxiety. I established the Catherine Legacy Foundation, a fund that pays for forensic accountants and legal counsel for young adults who suspect their families are bleeding them dry. 6 months later, I sat on the terrace of Grandma Catherine's estate, overlooking the valley. The air was warm, and the only sound was the soft clink of crystal as we drank our tea. For a long time, that clink had been the sound of everything breaking. Now, it was just a polite sound in a quiet life. You survived them, Ashley, she said, her voice steady and proud. You stayed kind when they were cruel. I stayed focused. I corrected her. I learned that family is not about blood. It is about who does not forge your name on a check. I named my podcast Glass Half Full because for years I was told I was lucky to have scraps. Now I am the one pouring the tea. I do not check their social media. I do not wish them ill. I just do not let them occupy a single line in my ledger anymore. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that they are worth more than their family's expectations. Subscribe for more stories of justice.